So our last but not least brown cow talk, why here, why now brown cow, is from over on the Malheur National Forest. And Amanda Lindsay is here. She's a district silviculturist there. She's going to be joined by Dave Hallemeyer, who used to be the district ranger who was out there working when some of these projects were developed. And they're going to tell you the Malheur story through creative dance. Is that right, Dave? Help me welcome them to the stage, everybody.
So before we get started, I know this was the last talk before the panel, so I brought candy. There's probably not enough for everybody, but just think of it as a unified budget exercise.
Okay, so you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay, just making sure. I wanted to say before we start, if you'll notice on the program, it said that Sasha Fertig, who's a NEPA planner, who's now currently on the Deschutes National Forest, and Bob Hassmiller, who is a hydrologist, who's now on the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest, were supposed to be here today presenting with us. But for personal reasons, they couldn't make it. But we wanted to, recognize them because they were instrumental in creating the presentation, and they've been instrumental in going through the process that we're going to talk about today. So first of all, we want to set the stage. And so now we're going to go back to 2012. And there were several factors that aligned up in 2012 to create what I'd like to call the perfect storm. On the Malheur, we had the Blue Mountain Forest Partners Collaborative, which is our collaborative on the North Zone, which was really picking up and gaining momentum, and they were really coming together and starting to be a cohesive group and to really work with the forests well. We also had our resource areas were not in alignment on the forest. So like our resource, our disciplines were not working together very well to come and to plan projects. And projects were taking a very, very long time. This is the Galena, whoops, that's the wrong button. This is the Galena, that's the wrong button again. The Galena Record of Decision, which was an EIS that was in the process of being planned at that time, and it literally took 17 years in the making to get a signed decision. So we weren't very efficient, and our timber targets were very, very low. We were in there around 25 million board feet a year, which really had a huge impact on our communities. And then the last remaining lumber mill in Grant County announced that it was going to shut down. And that really put a halt to a lot of things, and a lot of people stopped and said, whoa, this can't happen. If we lose our last remaining sawmill, we lose our capacity to do any sort of restoration treatments or any sort of treatments, and this is going to really, really hurt our community. And so a solution was derived from the forests and the collaborative and from Congress and a whole bunch of other entities, and that solution was accelerated restoration. So now we're in accelerated restoration, and the forest has to come up with a plan on how to tackle this issue quickly, right now. And so we kind of had a grassroots, I guess, approach to a lot of what we've done on the Malheur. At this time, we did have a strategic plan for the forest, and it helped dictate, where our priority areas were, but it was very vegetation and fuels centric. And so we were still scattered as specialists. Our aquatics group were working in different areas as our silviculture and our fields group, and we weren't being very efficient. And so the district leadership teams came together, and they came to the table, and they developed a new strategic plan for the whole entire district, which was then put together for the whole entire forest on how we were going to march across the landscape and how we were going to treat our forests. And this was a very integrated approach, and it was done through a lot of compromises. And so we said basically, here are the high priorities for vegetation and fuels, and here are the high priority areas for wildlife, and here are the high priority areas for aquatics, and we're all going to kind of figure out like how to get to those high priority areas in a reasonable amount of time. And we'll work on this project, even though it's not our high priority area, knowing that we're going to get to the next project, which is our high priority area next. And so this helped focus our efforts and helped all the resources, working on the same project at the same time. It also has increased our efficiency, and through time, now that we've gone through several projects in this plan, we've realized that it is very needed for our forest to help keep its priorities straight. So we always know where we're going next, and we always need to stay focused on, we can't let ourselves get enticed by all the little pet projects that always come up. We have to stay focused on this plan.
Okay, so the collaborative at this time that we had the Galena project signed asked a really important question, and that was, what about the greater landscape? How does this project relate to the greater landscape? We're moving into the next area, which was the big mosquito area, and we made it an emphasis to look at a larger landscape. That larger landscape was the entire Middle Fork of the John Day Basin, not just the planting area. The big mosquito project was going to be in the lower portion of that planting area, so it gave us a good hinge point to work up the basin. We realized that we weren't going to do this in one big gulp. For those of you that have been around, you know that saying, big gulp was not a popular way of doing it, so we actually came down with a strategy of breaking it into 3 component parts. We were going to do veg NEPA, we were going to do aquatic restoration NEPA, and we were going to do range NEPA. Now that may seem like, well, you're taking on 3 as opposed to 1, but what we did is we kept folks focused and we kept folks laser on the purpose, the need, the purpose and need, and why here, why now. With the vegetation NEPA, we looked at riparian systems and we looked at upland systems. We connected the watershed from valley bottom to ridgetop. For the aquatic restoration, we looked at more web features, connectivity of the aquatic to the upland, floodplain restoration, that sort of thing. And then there's lots of cows in Eastern Oregon, and we knew that the range NEPA was one part of it that could hamstring us and not allow us to move forward. So we actually split that out, and we have a lot of T&E species that we need to do consultation with, and we're coming up to a reconsultation piece, so we made that separate. What that allowed us to do was focus our data collection. When we were able to break these out in 3 component parts, it gave our specialists more ability of sort of chewing at the problem and figuring out what it needed to be done. By combining the data collection, we knew we were going to be in there for aquatics, we knew we were going to be in their range, and so it expanded the vision of what this project entailed. And when they were out there collecting information, they were able to collect information more efficiently. It also allowed us to look at our travel management planning. The Malheur is one of the few forests in the region that doesn't have a access and travel management plan. And the way we're getting around this is we're doing it in pieces by each of these planning areas. And it's allowing us to state the why here, why now for those really tough decisions about which roads need to be closed and which roads can be opened. And we actually are able to look at the landscape as a transportation system. Recreation also was involved, and we did watershed restoration action plans and allotment management plans, all tied in with this data collection.
Okay, so as Dave mentioned, we focused our efforts on data collection, and we collected a whole suite of data. We have LiDAR almost across our whole entire forest now, and we're really working on the tools that we can use through LiDAR to help get more comprehensive and better data. We also collect stand exams, and we do it a little bit differently than some forests do. We don't collect exam data on just the stands that we are going to treat. We're actually out there beforehand, before we have a proposal, collecting stand exam data. And we do it on a representation of stands across the planning area. And then we use the nearest neighbor analysis to actually to populate the stands that don't have data with stand exam data so that we have wall-to-wall data for our planning areas. We also collect stream surveys, road surveys, heritage surveys, wildlife surveys, all the hosts of surveys that need to be collected for the vegetation NEPA, the aquatics NEPA, and the range NEPA.
Amanda, I might add that another part of the data that we needed to collect was brought to us by the collaborative, in that they got research scientists out on site. We started visiting sites early to try and figure out which data we needed to collect. And so that was integral also in allowing us to do a bigger look at the entire area.
Okay, so I've noticed that there's a lot of different forests that have their version of the NEPA triangle. And the Malheur has our version of the NEPA triangle as well. And I've seen this theme today that, really we've front-loaded this NEPA triangle. And we've really increased tremendously the amount of public outreach and working with partnerships that we are doing. And so, as we go into a planning area, and this planning area is determined by our larger forest scale program and work map, we really start off with working with our partners right from the very beginning, before we even have any sort of proposals, through data collection and having a lot of field trips on the ground, doing public meetings, and talking to the collaborative about the projects, right up front at collaborative meetings. And that really feeds into how we develop our proposed action now. Another thing that we work very closely with the collaborative is doing science workshop and getting lots of science input, and we love site-specific science on our forest, and so working with researchers from Oregon State and from TNC, to be able to come in and to share their expertise and their knowledge and what they're finding out about our landscapes as well. And then as we develop the proposed action and actually move into the NEPA process, we continue that public engagement through scoping meetings, public comment meetings, and working with the county courts and county court briefings. And then we work with our partners in developing watershed restoration action plans, and we develop zones of agreement with the collaborative as well. And it's really an integrated process. They are the collaborative's zones of agreement. They're authored by the collaborative, but we work hand in hand with them, to come up with areas of agreement that we have around how we treat our forests and how we manage the forests. And then at the bottom end, with once we've actually signed the decision, we have formal monitoring and evaluation that we're actually doing through the collaborative and through partnerships with researchers at OSU. And then we also have informal monitoring that we do, and we go out and we take field trips, and we look at treatments, and we say, well, did we actually do what we said we were going to do, number one? And then if we did, how did it turn out? Did it turn out how we thought it would turn out, or do we want to do something different in the future? And we utilize, what we've learned from those to actually feed into the next planning process and to start the whole cycle over again. So as we stepped into accelerated restoration, we were working with our partners and with the collaborative, but it created a whole new dynamic, and our partners had to figure out how to navigate through accelerated restoration themselves as well. And so one of the approaches that the collaborative took was going from project-based discussions to issue-based discussions and tackling large-scale issues. And they did this through field trips, science workshops, and these zones of agreement document that I was talking about. And we have zones of agreement now for upland forest restoration and for riparian restoration and for aspen restoration and looking at wildlife treatments and goshawks. And so we also have extensive public meetings at every phase through the NEPA process. We have a public meeting, and we get a variety of people that come to those meetings and a variety of input as well. Okay, so now getting into actually our NEPA process and how we kind of go about formulating our NEPA documents. Our purpose and need really focuses around resiliency. And we look at landscape resiliency, and the way we look at it is that you can't separate the socioeconomic portion with the ecological portion. And I say that because our communities are really tied, at least in Grant County and Harney County, to our forests. They're tied to our forests for their economic livelihoods. They're tied to our forests for their way of life, and and for their recreational enjoyment. On the ecological side, we also focus on process and function, and these are all supported by our forest plan and our collaborative efforts, and a lot of the scientific literature that's coming out these days. And I just wanted to dive into this diagram. This was a diagram that we developed just to help tell our story and to help kind of show graphically, how we look at resiliency. So we're going to get into a little closer into just what resiliency means to us. And we've defined it, and this is our definition, as the capacity of a system to avoid, absorb, or resist a disturbance, and the potential for recovery after a disturbance, and system stability. And what we're saying is that these feedback loops feed each other, and that we really have to have healthy systems to help produce healthy communities. And vice versa, we need healthy communities so that we can help work on producing healthy systems. And we try to focus on using ecological principles to provide for socioeconomic resiliency, and scientific principles to create and maintain ecological resiliency. And then if we go down to the ecological side of things, we're really looking at the system as a whole and what disturbances and processes drive the structure and the function of the system, and then how we can apply management across our landscape to help restore these structures and these processes on the landscape. And so, one example we use is fire regimes. The Malheur National Forest had a frequent low severity fire regime historically, and fire was probably the major disturbance across the landscape. And so, what did that frequent low severity fire regime create? What type of stand structures and stand densities and species composition, fuel loading, wood supply, litter fall, primary production, all the things that, all the services that frequent fire regime would have created. And then, how are they departed on the landscape from historical conditions? And then how can we use a suite of management actions such as, commercial thinning or pre-commercial thinning or prescribed burning to help restore that structure and that function on the landscape? And we can, we do that with many different disturbance processes. Climate change is another one. Floodplain connectivity and riparian restoration is another big one on our forests that we talk about a lot, as far as how do we restore our stream systems, restore incised channels. How do we reconnect the floodplain, the stream with the floodplain? How do we utilize what we know about nature and how the processes of nature, like building beaver dams. And beavers were, very, very good architects. And how do we, replicate what they've done through beaver dam analogs and large woody debris placement to restore some of those processes.
So let's get into the purpose and need statements. But before we do that, I need to say this, it's very important that before you even start down this path, that there's clear leader's intent about what you're trying to accomplish. I think part of the time that when we talk about efficiency is because people like myself haven't done our job as far as establishing clear intent about what we want to do with this particular landscape and the flexibility the team has to explore options and work with collaboration and do that. So pretty general purpose and needs statement: maintain and improve landscape resiliency and manage for diverse forest composition, stocking levels, and pattern to maintain healthy ecological functions and process with a complex disturbance. Whew, it's a mouthful, but you know what? It covers everything that I've ever had a specialist come to me and say, I want to try this, or I think we need to do this, or the collaborative would come to us and say, we think you need to do this. I already have it covered in my purpose and need statement. We need to be laser, but we need to be laser at specific spots. So the other part is promote forest conditions that will allow for reintroduction of fire upon the landscape. We've heard a lot about that today. Contribute to social economic health of those enjoying multiple uses in the planning area. Another important part that we heard about today. The part that, you can change slides. So the proposed action development, we added a step to that triangle. If you remember, when you looked at the triangle, down in this corner of the triangle, there was that engagement. We started with a project action letter, and the project action letter was basically direction from myself to the team that I want you to explore this landscape, I want you to work with the collaborative, I want you to work with the partners, and I want to learn as much as I can about this landscape before we decide what we're going to do. And so Amanda mentioned we had a lot of public meetings. We started with a public meeting where we got folks together and said, here's a piece of landscape, what should we do? And we were that general. We would mention to them that we wanted to do something on this landscape, and then we let them write the script. We took that information back, and within a week we had that processed, and we were giving them the results of that. And then we told our resource stories also. The other part of it, the project action letter, was a storytelling session. All the specialists, we tried different methods. We actually put it on YouTube for the Big Mosquito Project, and you know, we had 20-minute discussions from each specialist telling their story about that particular piece of landscape. That didn't work well when we presented it to the collaborative and nearly killed them in a 4-hour meeting. But it was important information, so we figured out a different way of doing it. And we tried to, it was iterative. We tried to find the best way of sharing information. But it came down to storytelling. Then we just used that information that we gathered from the publics. We used that information that we got internally from our specialists, the information we got from the collaborative, and then we generated a proposal of different types of projects that we're moving forward on.
So we learned a lot of lessons through this process. Some of the lessons that we learned were, you know, as Dave talked about, like with the resource stories and really figuring out like how to best relay the information that we had to share. You know, another one was, you know, we're developing all these ecological treatments, but we're still calling them the same things in our document. And so the collaborative, members of the collaborative said, well, why don't you actually start calling them what you're really trying to do in your document? And so this is the Ragged Ruby project and an example of, you know, how we went from saying, well, we're going to pre-commercial thin here and we're going to commercial thin here, to saying, you know, we're actually going to be doing like dry meadow and scabland flat restoration, and we're going to be doing dry pine restoration and mixed conifer restoration and white bark pine restoration. And here are the suite of activities that we're going to, you know, complete underneath this restoration to complete the restoration. We also had, you know, we have formal monitoring and informal monitoring, and we discussed that earlier, and that really feeds into, you know, the next NEPA process. And so we're continually adapting and continually trying to learn and do it better the next time. around. Some other highlights that we forgot to mention were, the integration between specialists has really allowed a lot of unique projects to come out, a lot of working together has really fostered a team environment where, your specialists, even though like I'm the silviculturist, I can talk aquatics and our aquatic staff can talk silviculture because, we work together so closely now and our proposals are so integrated that, that we understand each other's disciplines and we can represent each other's disciplines.
I'd like to add one other lesson learned from line, and that's when you allow yourself to be vulnerable and not try to drive the bus but have other people drive the bus, you end up really having a better trip and you get to experience a lot more. And so it's, a lot of times we look at a timber cut or we look at a target. I found out through doing it in this fashion, I far exceeded any timber target I could ever get if I just focused on a timber target, or I exceeded a fuels treatment target than if I just focused on that fuels treatment target. Because of what Amanda said, there is a synergism going on between the team that our fisheries biologist would be going to our fuels person and going, hey, why don't you try this? Or our range person would be going to our aquatics or botanists and saying, hey, how about this? And it created so much energy that, targets became pretty simple to meet.
Yeah, and it's a different perspective in that when you're looking at the restoration approach, that those targets are really a byproduct of the restoration. They're not what's driving it.
So with this, someone said it takes a village. It takes more than a village, and I can't say enough for the Blue Mountain Forest Partners and their efforts in this. They started working in this area in 2007? 2003, thanks SJ. I knew she would correct me if I looked up there. And so it's a long haul, and it's a process that takes a long time, but here's just a few suite of the people, and you can see there's agency folks and there's non-agency folks, so thank you.
Do you guys have any questions?
Make their way up here. Questions for Dave and Amanda?
The question is, how did we pay for formal monitoring? So we are a very fortunate forest. We're a CFLR forest. And so 10% of that budget actually can go to monitoring, and that's what pays for a lot of it. So.
You guys mentioned you just have public meetings at every step of the project, which I think is really cool. And we've tried doing that, and we found out that the more public meetings we have, we get like hundreds of people. And we found that if we just have like one or two, then and the fields, we actually get a lot of attendance. So did you guys have luck with getting a lot of people to attend the meeting and kind of taking them along with the project?
So the question was, and I'm going to kind of rephrase it, just do we get very many people at our public meetings? It really depends. It depends on the area and the topic. We have had, as little as like 4 or 5, and we've had as many as like 30. So it really just depends on what project we're working on and where kind of we are at this stage. Some of them, yes, are kind of slow, but we've committed to doing it because we do think it's a valuable process, even if we're only reaching just a handful of people.
Okay. We're going to need to move on to the panel. Thank you very much, you guys.